Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Global Roundtable webinar series organised by the International Association of Constitutional Law on Democracy 2020, Assessing Constitutional Decay, Breakdown and Renewal Worldwide. Bienvenue à cette table ronde, une série de webinaires organisés par l'Association internationale de droit constitutionnel au sujet de la démocratie 2020, évaluation du déclin et du renouvellement constitutionnel. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I'm located, the Bunurong, Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land across Australia, and to pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today. Now, the roundtable itself is taking place from the 18th to the 26th of November, 9 webinars across 5 days. We're featuring 58 speakers from 30 countries, and our aim is really to foster a truly global conversation about the direction and renewal of democracy worldwide. It's co-sponsored by the Laureate Programme in Comparative Constitutional Law at Melbourne Law School, which is funded by the Australian Research Council, and by the Melbourne School of Government at University of Melbourne. I'm Tom Daly. I'm your chair for this session, and I'm Deputy Director at the School of Government, and I'm co-convener of the roundtable itself alongside the one and only Professor Wojciech Sadurski from the University of Sydney. Now, the aim of this webinar is simply to pick out a number of key issues of global relevance to start the discussion. So we're going to be talking about academic freedom, technology and inequality, voter suppression, constitutionalism in China, and abusive judicial review. Now, the format for the webinar is quite simple. We're going to start with a formal welcome, followed by short memorials to two leading lights of the association, Professors Lydia Fleiner and Hector Fix-Fierro. Then we'll have 4 individual presentations of about 10 minutes each, followed by open discussion with the panelists and the audience members. Now, audience members can send questions to the panelists throughout the webinar using the Q&A function, and we'll select questions to discuss in the second half of the webinar during the open discussion. So without any further ado, we're delighted to have with us to formally open the proceedings, the president of the association, Professor Adrienne Stone, who is Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor at Melbourne Law School and Director of the Centre for Comparative Constitutional Studies at the Law School. Now, Adrienne is not only opening the proceedings, but speaking to us about a highly important issue: academic freedom, constitutionalism, and democracy. Adrienne, over to you.
Let me start by acknowledging that I am also speaking from Wurundjeri country today, and I extend my respects to the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I would like also to acknowledge the conveners of this roundtable, Professor Wojciech Sadurski and Associate Professor Tom Daly. I was struck when they came to the IACL with this idea for its creativity and its broad academic vision. They have, of course, since then proved not only prescient, but also have displayed extraordinary determination to make this event work in the face of the pandemic. And the energy and attention to detail that is required has not gone unnoticed. And I extend my very heartfelt thanks on the behalf of the International Association of Constitutional Law to you. And I should say that I have had the good fortune to attend many wonderful IACL roundtables, but seldom have I felt the sense of urgency associated with a roundtable and its topic. And as I do today, democratic decay was already so deeply troubling more than a year ago when this roundtable was first proposed. And now, of course, we have all been shaken in many ways to our very core by the pandemic. The IACL is, of course, a scientific organisation that aims to promote the study of constitutional law, but also to promote the practical realization of democratic principles. And because of the deep connection that this roundtable has to those ideas, I am just really proud to be opening this roundtable on behalf of the IACL today. And Tom and Wojciech have very nicely also asked me to say something about one of my research interests, academic freedom, and its connection to democracy. And I will do so briefly, although of course, if I go over time, you might mute my microphone and treat me like a presidential debate candidate. But let me just turn to that just for the moment. I think all of us share as scholars a very deep intuition that there is a deep connection between democracy and academic freedom. I mean, you can work back from the facts of life apart from anything else. Emerging authoritarian governments inevitably regard universities and their academics as threats and move against them, as the sorry tale of the fate of the Central European University, which I hope will now thrive in its new home, demonstrates. And of course, established authoritarian governments ensure that universities and their academics are under their control. Now, this is an important intuition that deserves further thought and explanation. And while I accept, of course, that universities are incredibly important institutions of democracy and that academic freedom is an incredibly important democratic value, I will say that I confess to feeling a bit uneasy about some of the arguments that are advanced to explain the connection. One of the most common arguments that is put forward is that universities are important democratic institutions and academic freedom is therefore important because universities are responsible through their teaching for creating an educated and critical citizenry. That strikes me both as, I think, unsupported empirically, that graduates of universities are somehow better citizens, and in any event, only partial, given that it is not and should not be the case that all citizens attend university. The other argument that is often put forward sees universities as simply extensions of the public forum in some sense. And universities are important to democracy because they're a place in which political contestation takes place. Now, I think that's an even more fundamental kind of mistake about universities because it overlooks the truly distinctive and socially important thing that universities do, which is the production of knowledge through teaching and research. So the aim of my remarks is to persuade you that there is a connection between democracy and this core activity of universities and to consider its implications for academic freedom. The argument I make simply has three simple propositions. First, that the university's essential and distinctive functions as a production of knowledge through teaching and learning. Second, that we protect academic freedom because it creates the conditions for the production of knowledge. And thirdly, that knowledge is both a public good of a general kind and specifically a democratic good. So knowledge is a democratic good. The first two propositions are, I hope at least for this audience, relatively uncontroversial. I'll say only a few words about them to rebuff some of the most common misunderstandings. So when I say that university's essential and distinctive function is the production of knowledge, of course, I conceive of knowledge in a way that encompasses moral, religious, ideological, and political claims, as well as aesthetic and artistic judgments, as well as the more traditional facts about the world. Knowledge in this sense has a human face. It bears the imprint of its maker. It's provisional. It might be revised and overturned. And reasonable disagreement will persist even in the face of good faith inquiry about knowledge. But understanding these matters does not undermine the case that universities advance knowledge in a meaningful sense. Secondly, let me say something about the connection between academic freedom and knowledge that is important. And that is the key to understanding academic freedom. It is an freedom to engage in intellectual inquiry, which is not itself an unconstrained activity. Academic inquiry pursues knowledge in distinctive ways through the academic disciplines, which are characterized by standards and methods designed to ensure expertise and independence in research. That is why mastering these methods is part of our research training. And we learn, among other things, though the methods and standards of disciplines differ, but all of them insist on things like evidence, justification, exposing of ideas systematically to tests capable of invalidating them, and they require independent judgment. And that is the heart of academic freedom. While academic methods and disciplinary methods can and should be contested, academic freedom requires that the discipline is ultimately self-governing. So if we understand universities in that way, pursuing knowledge, and that they're pursuing knowledge in distinctive ways, let me move very briefly to my third proposition, that knowledge is a public and a democratic good. Before turning to its democratic implications, let me say that I think that knowledge is a public good that extends beyond democracy. So it is a public good for peoples who do not live in democratic regimes. The benefits of research in sciences might be the most obvious, direct and tangible. We can see that research in these fields has the capacity to help us live longer and healthier lives, create material goods for humans to enjoy or control and contract our environment. But the social sciences are often highly practical as well, helping us to understand and improve our government, economy, social structures. But even disciplines that yield no practical and material benefits are enormously important. The humanities especially help us understand the human consequence of scientific progress, and they interrogate fundamental ideas like justice, equality, and morality. In short, they help us understand what a good society is. But on top of these benefits, I want to say that knowledge is a democratic good in two important ways. First, knowledge is a democratic good in the sense that it responds to the citizens' need to understand the society in which they live in order to engage democratically. A critical part of democratic government relies on the participation of an informed citizenry in public good discourse and ultimately in electing governments and holding them to account. The complexity of modern governance is such that at any given point, any number of public issues can only be understood in the light of reliable and independent research of the kind that only universities produce. So knowledge is the first step towards a properly informed democratic engagement and effective accountability. But secondly, I want to say university research responds to a citizen's need in a democracy for a mechanism for resolving our disagreements. To recall, I have argued that academic research is distinctive for its independence and for the fact that it arises from a disciplined method of inquiry. Now, it therefore gives a measure of confidence, of course, not blind acceptance. That means it is a particularly productive mechanism for resolving disagreements about knowledge. And it turns out to have knowledge in which we can have some confidence and agreed, if only provisional ways of resolving our disputes about what is true, turns out to be a precondition for a functioning democratic government. And you can see that very vividly in the pathologies of the modern speech economy. As we see playing out around us all the time, we simply cannot function as a democracy in circumstances of political polarization where opposing forces differ not just as to their worldview, but to the very facts on which those worldviews depend and upon how we resolve our disputes about those matters. So this is, in my view, the most fundamental way in which universities are among those institutions that can ensure a proper functioning democracy. It turns out that they are a very important part of the social infrastructure upon which a meaningful form of public discourse and democratic participation can be pursued. Now, of course, I want to acknowledge another way in which universities and their scholars are important, and the academic freedom that protects them is important. And that, of course, is for those amongst us who choose to live their scholarly lives as activists in support of democracy. And I must say that, of course, because we are in the presence of, among others, Professor Wojciech Soderski, who has been so important in this regard. And without wishing to in any way to draw attention away from that very important activity. I do want to say that I think we should all, as scholars, understand ourselves as engaged in very important promotion of democracy by the construction of conditions necessary for its success. And that seems to me to be the most fundamental connection between academic freedom, constitutionalism, and democracy. And it's one in which I think we are engaged in some small measure over the next 5 days of our seminars. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. Such an important issue to cover. And I think we'll be hearing more about polarization and the need for a fact-based democracy when we move to Shireen and Andrew's talk, the first talk in the four talks. But for now, we're going to move to our short 2 memorials. So first we have Professor Cheryl Saunders, who's President Emeritus of the Association, remembering former Secretary General Professor Lydia Fleiner. So over to you, Cheryl.
Thanks very much, Tom, and congratulations on putting this splendid event together. Well, colleagues, I am so pleased to have the opportunity to pay tribute at the outset of this amazing event to Lydia Fleiner, who passed away last year after a long and debilitating illness. Lydia was a long-standing friend and colleague who made an impression wherever she went through her ideas and the force of her personality. It's hard to believe she's not still with us, zooming in from Switzerland or Belgrade. Importantly for present purposes, Lydia was a key figure in the IACL. The interaction of her career with the evolution of the association throws light on both, and I'd like to tell that story briefly today. Lydia was born in 1948 and grew up in Belgrade, in Tito's Yugoslavia. Her intellectual roots developed from there, eventually branching out to embrace the world. She was 34 when the IACL was formed in 1982 as the Global Association of Constitutional Law. This was still the period of the Cold War, with no end apparently in sight. And one of the goals of the IACL was to bring what was then called East and West together. Consistently with that goal, the Secretariat was established in Belgrade, with Pavle Nikolic as Secretary General and the young, promising, intellectually curious Lydia Basta as Deputy Secretary General. The first executive committee was inclusive of states and regions, but entirely male. If anyone can be described as the founding mother of the association, it's Lydia. The Secretariat remained in Belgrade for some time after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but its center of operations eventually shifted to Rotterdam with the appointment of Piet Ackermans as the new Secretary General. Around this time, Lydia moved too to Fribourg in Switzerland, where she married Thomas Fleiner, a former president of the IACL, forging a deep and productive personal and professional partnership that was to last for the rest of her life. Inevitably, she remained closely involved in IACL activities. And when Piet Ackermans died suddenly, she was appointed Secretary General, the only person in the history of the IACL so far to have held both such positions. The task was formidable: to create a new secretariat, drawing on such records as existed in Rotterdam and retrieving the association's funds from Belgrade. All of this with a World Congress in the offing. The success of that endeavor leaves the association in her debt. Lydia remained Secretary General until the Secretariat was moved to South Africa, again as a symbol of the IACL's commitment to adequately representing the world of constitutional law. It was a commitment of which she heartily approved. In recognition of her many contributions, she was appointed the first life member of the association in 1997. There's a great deal more to Lydia Fleiner's professional life than her involvement with the International Association of Constitutional Law. I can't do justice to it all here, but as a sample, she played a leading role at the Institute of Federalism in Fribourg, held another chair in Belgrade, was a significant figure in the field of minority rights in Europe, and promoted scholarly dialogue in various forms in countries around the world, ranging from China to Ethiopia. She understood constitutional diversity and she was committed to the potential of dialogue in transcending difference. The IACL is fortunate to have been able to draw on someone with the insights and capacities of Lydia Basterfine. Thanks, Tom. Over to you.
Thank you, Cheryl. What a wonderful memorial, and hopefully that drive towards greater inclusiveness and the world association that Lydia helped build is reflected in this roundtable itself.
I think so indeed, even in today's panel.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for that. And we're going to move to our second short memorial, and where we have our executive committee member, Professor Jose Maria Serna from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, el Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, remembering Professor Hector Fix Fierro. Over to you, Jose.
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everyone. It is my honor to speak today about Héctor Fix Fierro. Héctor was born on August 15 of 1961, and with great sadness, we learned of his passing on May 28, 2020, as a result of a long battle with cancer. Héctor is survived by his wife, Jacqueline, and his 3 children, Valentina, Markel, and Verena, as well as by his father, Professor Dr. Héctor Fix Zamudio, and his sister, Cristina. Héctor graduated with the highest honors from the School of Law of the National University of Mexico in 1987, and then he pursued advanced studies at the University of Bremen, Germany, where he earned his PhD in 1998. Héctor Fix Fierro pioneered in the area of sociology of law. His work particularly focused on the organization and operation of courts, a field in which he was Mexico's leading expert. 1 week before Héctor passed away, he participated in the book launch of his last publication, titled The Power of Judicial Power and Legal Modernization in Contemporary Mexico. He was also active in the field of constitutional law and made relevant contributions in the area of human rights. Héctor Fix Fierro was a distinguished and dedicated mentor, teaching sociology of law at the School of Law of Mexico's National University. He also taught courses at many other academic institutions. Notably, he was a regular visiting professor at the University of Houston Law Center. Héctor Fix Fierro was a passionate translator of legal works. One of his most important translations was the monumental book of Reinhold Sibelius titled General Theory of the State, which Héctor translated from German to Spanish when he was in his early 20s. Between 2006 and 2014, Héctor Fix Fierro was director of the Institute of Legal Research of the National University of Mexico. As such, he was the leading figure in organizing the 8th World Congress of Constitutional Law that took place in Mexico City in 2010. Moreover, he was a first vice president of the International Association of Constitutional Law. On June the 1st of 2020, the National University of Mexico organized a posthumous tribute in honor of Héctor Fix Fierro, with the participation of the president of the university, the directors of the university's Institute of Legal Research and of the School of Law, the president of Mexico's Supreme Court, and many of his colleagues and friends. Beyond his qualities as a scholar, Héctor Fix Fierro was a considerate, generous, and thoughtful person. He will be dearly missed by his friends, colleagues, and students all over the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Serna, for that beautiful tribute to Professor Fierro. It really shows us that For all of us in the association, we really are standing on the shoulders of giants, and it's fantastic to be able to remember both Professor Fleiner and Professor Fierro in the roundtable today. So I'm delighted now to move to our 4 10-minute presentations. And we're going to have hopefully plenty of time for open discussion after these. We're going to be hearing about technology inequality and democracy in Australia. We're going to be hearing about voter suppression, about constitutionalism scholarship in China, and then finally, abusive judicial review. So a very warm welcome to all of our speakers for these 4 presentations. And we're starting with Shireen Morris and Andrew Ball on technological change as a key facilitator of democratic decline. Is Australia at risk? Now, anyone who saw their interview with me before the webinar will know that Shireen and Andrew have known each other since their school days. Shireen is a constitutional lawyer at Macquarie Law School, and Andrew is a senior manager and technology guru at Accenture. So they've teamed up to get a fuller view of this issue, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you for the opportunity that allows Andrew and I to share our work with you. The blog we presented is a short version of a longer article that we've been working on, which is a collaboration, as you said, between my insights as a constitutional lawyer and Andrew's data analysis, basically on economic and political trends in Australia. So we argue that technology is a key facilitator of democratic decline, and Australia, though rightly considered a healthy and stable democracy, is not immune to the risks posed. And for us, 3 entwined trajectories present cause for concern. The first is technology-enabled automation, globalisation, and market liberalisation are propelling job polarisation, so a hollowing out of the economic middle and inequality. Secondly, these forces may in turn be facilitating political polarisation and declining trust in political institutions that fail to address the concerns of those left behind by those economic trajectories. Thirdly, technology is directly disrupting Australian political discourse and culture, amplifying discontent, supercharging polarisation, and really thwarting our ability to conduct rational and truthful political debates.
So in terms of the first one of those trajectories, we know technology is driving polarisation and increasing economic inequality. And it's really doing that through 3 areas. The first area is around automation. So we're seeing that certain types of jobs, abstract jobs, examples of this might be a lawyer, it might be a software engineer, or it might be someone in a managerial type role. The productivity of those professions has actually been enhanced by technology. And as a result, we're seeing increasing employment shares and strong wage growth. In contrast to that, we've got routine jobs. So examples of those will be things such as manufacturing workers and also office administration workers. Those types of jobs have been predominantly displaced by technology. So as a result, we're seeing decreasing employment shares and stagnant wages for people in those professions. The second area is around globalisation, and we really do see globalisation being enabled by technology, in particular through improvements such as better telecommunications, shipping containerisation, and then also reduced air travel costs. And the third area is market liberalisation. So whilst there isn't a direct link between technology and market liberalisation, there's an indirect one through globalisation, in that as countries and governments have sought to increase the living standards of their people in an increasingly globalised world, they've done that via market liberalisation. And in Australia, that's really taken, that really occurred via mostly the Hawke and Keating reforms of the 1980s, which led to reduced trade barriers, an accord in which wage growth was dampened and greater workforce flexibility. All of those factors combined lead to job polarisation, which really hollows out those middle skilled routine jobs and also weakens the middle class. And we've absolutely seen that in Australia. I think it's also interesting to note that given that we've got those abstract jobs, they're primarily located in inner city areas, and you've got the routine jobs being more in suburban and regional areas. Those areas have been disproportionately impacted by these particular changes.
So as Andrew explained, since the 1980s, there's been this widening inequality in Australia and also this increase in underutilisation that you see over time. Well, this has impacts for democracy. So over the same period since the 1980s, we've seen trust in Australian government gradually decreasing, although with some highs and lows, polarisation also increasing. And we think this is because when living standards stagnate, then trust and optimism declines. And so research showed that, you know, Australians knew who the winners and losers of these trajectories were, and they were getting more insecure and angry, particularly in the regions. So by 2018, Australian satisfaction with democracy was at its lowest level since the 1970s. There's growing voter disengagement. Ian McAllister argues that a Trump-like disaffection is taking hold, which should be a wake-up call for political elites, as more Australians see Parliament as unresponsive to people's needs. So one of the ideas that has animated our work is Thomas Piketty's theory that Western democracies are increasingly governed by a contemporary coalition between what he calls the Brahmin left, so the intellectual and cultural elite, often at universities like where we are now, and the merchant right, the financial and commercial elite. So these two sides, despite some identity-based culture warring, both largely defend, he argues, the economic status quo. And he says this is why we've seen centre-left parties declining over time, because they've stopped representing the traditional working class base and begun to focus more on the winners of globalisation. So we think that Piketty's theory finds some resonance in Australia, where the ALP primary vote has been in steady decline since the 80s. Minor parties are on the rise, especially in the regions who feel more left behind. And the third thing that we're seeing is increasing polarisation. So fewer voters rate themselves as being in the ideological centre now. The polarisation of very engaged voters is increasing at almost twice the rate of less engaged voters. And so there's particularly evident polarisation amongst politicians, with fewer Australian politicians rating themselves as moderate. So this basically suggests that in Australia, there's a growing disconnect between a rapidly polarising political elite and a more gradually polarising but increasingly disengaged public.
So in terms of the third trajectory that Shreen talked about at the start, is around how technology is impacting how we conduct our political discourse. And we know that technology is changing how we think and deliberate. So given the massive amounts of data growth, and we're looking at something like there's been a 50-fold increase in the amount of data that's online between the years 2010 and 2020. So massive increase. That has an impact on how we think and how we behave. So we're seeing reduced attention spans. We're certainly seeing decreased memory, but we're also seeing greater reliance on these online platforms to help navigate us through this avalanche of data. The way in which these online platforms, so think Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc., the way that they do it is they prioritize content which is the most engaging. That often means that content which is sensationalist, content which is extreme, and also content which targets niche audiences, so niche content for niche audiences, is prioritized. Another thing that these online platforms do will also provide a platform where people can rely on trusted family and friends for information. All of those things exacerbate fake news. And so perhaps the most prevalent example in Australia of fake news, or one of the best known one, was the death tax scare campaign that was run in the 2019 election. Completely fake, but also it was able to be piggybacked by certain political parties and political players as a part of their campaign. We're seeing echo chambers, tribalism, polarisation, again, primarily in that political class, so the politically engaged voters. And in contrast, you've got, a turning off of those political disengaged voters. So in other words, that creation of that spiral of silence. All of those factors combined, so fake news, echo chambers, and the other factors we've talked about, combine to dilute our collective understanding of facts and ultimately our ability to appropriately deliberate in democracies.
And I'll just add to that in the 2019 federal election, the internet actually overtook TV for the first time in Australia as the news source for voters. So the culture, the online culture is really directly impacting our democratic culture. So very quickly turning to solutions, given that there's three interrelated trajectories at play here, there's no one solution that's going to stop the trend, these concerning trends in Australia. You need holistic solutions. And you can't address democratic decay, we argue, without addressing the underlying economic trajectories. So in terms of technology-driven job polarisation and inequality, we think education is key. So when the pace of educational attainment lags behind the pace of technological advancement, that's when you see inequality increase. So that's why supporting education and particularly retraining workers, will be an increasing need for lifelong learning and micro-credentialing, training that extends throughout one's lifetime. That's going to be really important. Having said that, not everyone will be able to retrain and transition when their jobs and livelihoods disappear. So we advocate the idea of a federal job guarantee for those who can't transition, which should include renewed investment in domestic manufacturing. And research in Australia shows that 81% of Australians are concerned about automation displacing jobs. Around 67% support something like a job guarantee. Second thing is we do need reforms to counteract some of the trends we're seeing in public deliberation. So some of the work Paul Kildea has done shows that many Australians support increased use of direct democracy. And other research shows that deliberative mechanisms can be really effective in overcoming polarisation and even reducing susceptibility to fake news. So does that mean we should have citizens' assemblies? Does that mean we should have more use of plebiscites like we saw with the same-sex marriage scenario? But should we be using technology more productively instead of an expensive postal survey? Can we make use of mechanisms for e-democracy? Do we need to think about citizen-initiated referenda to overcome citizen disengagement? And the third thing is social media and internet reforms. So I think we need to be looking at truth in political advertising laws to combat fake news during election campaigns, as well as greater online political ad transparency. So showing audiences where the money funding particular ads come from. And do we need to look at requiring platforms to monitor fake news like we've seen Twitter doing recently? Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen, and thank you, Andrew. Really so much to stimulate discussion there, and clear that you're not just thinking about incremental policy change, but big ticket issues, big fixes for big problems. Really useful framing of job polarization versus political polarization and how they interact. And I'm sure a lot of people listening, those discussions will resonate a lot beyond Australia's borders as well. But talking about disaffection, about political polarization, about fake news, our second speaker, Mike Pal, is going to be speaking on the comparative constitutional law and politics of voter suppression. Mike is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law at University of Ottawa, and you've been kept quite busy, Mike, in recent times.
Thanks very much, Tom. There has been a lot going on in voter suppression, so cursed to have a relevant topic, I suppose. I just want to first of all thank the IACL and University of Melbourne and all the organizers, and to you and Wojciech in particular. It's been great discussion already around academic freedom and technology and democracy. And I wanted to congratulate Wojciech, I don't know if he's there, on his recent victory in the Polish courts, which I think should not go without congratulations. So I was very heartened to see that. So like Shireen and Andrew, my presentation on voter suppression is based on a longer article. So for any comments, questions, very much welcome. For those of you who were following the US election, I imagine that was most of you. You might even be following events in Pennsylvania, in a Pennsylvania courtroom right now. Allegations of voter suppression were a near daily occurrence. Okay? And there has been a significant academic discussion of voter suppression in the US literature for a number of years now, especially in quantitative political science, scholars trying to measure the impact of voter suppression. Are racial minority groups in particular being deterred from turning out to vote by restrictive voter ID laws, for example. What I want to do in the presentation, and I tried doing the blog post and the short video that Tom and I did, was to talk about voter suppression as a comparative phenomenon, to draw on the US experience, but to try to abstract from it, to try to understand the concept. And so voter suppression can be understood in a bunch of different ways. It comes in many forms and adapts to local conditions. But really the heart of my argument to you today in the 10 minutes that I have is to argue that voter suppression is really a tool that hollows out electoral democracy, and if taken to its logical conclusion, is actually consistent with electoral or competitive authoritarianism. So it's used in all sorts of different regimes, including in liberal democracies, including the United States, but it's a tool that is a common feature in authoritarian regimes that still do have elections. So it's about managing elections so that incumbents and governments, it's not as impossible for them to lose, but it makes it much more difficult for them to lose. And so first I'm going to talk about the what of voter suppression, what it is, and then I'd like to discuss how it operates, and then talk a bit about why would-be autocrats want to adopt it as a strategy. So the what, the how, and then the why. And so what is voter suppression? In the media and politicians use it to denote a bunch of different practices or activities. Some of them are campaign tactics, what we might commonly understand as dirty tricks, very common in the history of electoral democracy across the world. We could also understand voter suppression sometimes as the inadequate provision of resources, right, by the state to actually have a well-functioning election. And then especially after the 2016 US election, there's been kind of a global conversation building on some of those discussions about social media and technology platforms that we heard about in the last presentation, right? What if a foreign entity, government, or individual organization tries to interfere in a national domestic electoral conversation? So those are all types of voter suppression, but the one that is the most insidious and I think the most difficult to get a hold on from the point of view of comparative constitutional law or theory are laws legitimately, duly passed according to the proper procedures that deliberately make it harder for individuals to cast a ballot. Okay, and so voter suppression doesn't involve in 2020 that often outright bans or prohibitions on groups from voting, right? The reaction from the international community domestically would be very negative, and the cost would be very high for a regime that, say, tried to ban a religious group or tried to ban a particular ethnic group outright from voting. That is a very crude and obvious way to try to stop your opponents from casting ballots against you. Instead, what we see from would-be autocrats is a slightly more sophisticated version, where the goals are the same: to win elections, to make it harder to lose. But the election is still there. Everyone technically still has the right to vote and can cast a ballot, excepting some legitimate disputes on the edges around non-resident voters and prisoners voting and things like that. But the laws are passed deliberately to make it more difficult for individuals to actually cast the ballot. And so voter ID rules, onerous voter registration rules, or we can even think of literacy tests or poll taxes, to go back to the US example from prior to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And so I think part of the intuition from would-be autocrats is that constitutional courts are very good at recognizing why it is a harm to democracy to ban a group from voting, or to ban a political party from participating, or to criminalize and imprison opposition leaders. But we have much less background in constitutional theory, political theory, and courts have much less familiarity with, say, how many drop boxes each county should have for mail-in ballots for voters who want to cast their vote through the postal service, okay? Or how many polling stations should be in a given electoral district, or whether a student ID or a hunting or firearms license should be accepted or not accepted as identification at the polling station and what the partisan impacts of those various rules might be. So what is voter suppression? In my argument, can be applied to a variety of different campaign tactics, but really the heart of the problem is around laws that are passed that make it more difficult to cast a ballot. So how does it operate? How do these laws operate? They tend to be facially neutral, right? So they don't single out, they don't say all those who are likely to vote for the party opposing the government are banned from voting, right? Or have to pay more to vote or have to travel a longer distance in order to get the proper identification documents so they can cast a ballot. So they are facially neutral, but they try to achieve some of those similar ends. And they usually do so in the service of some pretextual larger motive, such as preventing electoral fraud. Okay, and we've seen President Trump make repeated claims that fraud exists in recent weeks. And so often the claim is made that fraud is there and therefore we need strict rules to prevent fraud from happening. And while we can agree that electoral fraud is a bad thing on its own, what voter suppression tactics have in common is that the goal of preventing fraud is exaggerated based on the evidence that fraud is actually happening. And in fact, what we see is more people are dissuaded from being able to cast a ballot, even if that is their constitutional right, by the strict voter identification or registration rules, or by the provision of polling locations or drop boxes or the like. So in this scenario, while it may be legitimate to try to prevent fraud, the cure is actually worse than the illness in the absence of some evidence that fraud is really happening. Another pretextual motive that is popular across many regimes is a claim that certain voters are simply not worthy or as worthy as their fellow citizens of casting a ballot. And these laws often demand some kind of positive affirmative action from voters, such as paying for the proper identity card, taking time off work to travel across the electoral district in order to register, something that has to be done in order to prove their commitment to democracy. And so courts and judges are often not able to identify why that is a harm for especially underprivileged or disadvantaged communities where that is a serious hurdle to exercising their fundamental rights. So facially neutral laws in the service of an objective that seems neutral and admirable, but which actually seriously causes damage to the constitutional right to vote. And so why do would-be autocrats adopt these tactics? Partly it's the perceived costs to them in comparison to other tactics, such as outright bans on political parties, imprisoning their political opponents, banning all members of a religious group from voting. Those are likely to trigger domestic protest and international condemnation. And so instead, would-be autocrats seek a more sophisticated path that doesn't achieve the same end, it's not as extreme, but which goes down that path of a managed democracy or electoral system. Another reason for the tactic to be pursued is that it's hard for courts to actually peer behind the pretextual motive. So the state claiming that voter fraud is a serious problem that must be addressed carries a lot of weight in courts, and it's difficult, especially prior to the election where the harm after which the harm could be measured, especially if the claim is brought prior to the election. It's hard for courts to identify what the actual constitutional problem is to say a strict voter ID rule that makes it more difficult to cast a ballot. So I think constitutional courts are good at knowing an outright ban is a harm, but less able to identify the harm when there's these pretextual motives. Third reason why voter suppression is often favored is it's a flexible approach. So we see it across a whole variety of different kinds of democracies. You might imagine that mandatory voting makes voter suppression less relevant. If everyone has to turn out to vote, making it harder for them to do so is just simply not as effective a tactic. I think there's some evidence, the case of Roe v. Electoral Commissioner, that the John Howard government in Australia actually changed the rules on voter registration that actually would have made it more difficult for certain groups likely to vote for the opposition parties or the left-wing parties from casting a ballot. So I'm happy to talk through that example and others. So I know I'm running out of time. In conclusion, voter suppression is not a standalone tactic. It often accompanies in this moment of democratic decay or decline attempts to undermine the judiciary or capture the media or even more extreme measures. But it is part and parcel of the attempt to hollow out electoral democracy, and it moves any given system closer down the road towards competitive or electoral authoritarianism. It doesn't on its own move it there, but it's part of the suite of tactics that goes down that path. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's really great to get a comparative perspective on this issue, not just the US experience. But it does remain so striking that it's such an issue in the one democratic superpower. But we're going to move on to the other superpower now. So we're going to be moving to discussion of constitutionalism scholarship in China and how it's changed over recent decades. And we're hearing from assistant professors Jai Han and Huang Chen from Wuhan and Renmin universities, speaking on how constitutionalism withers, explaining the changing discourse of constitutionalism in Chinese constitutional scholarship, 1981 to 2017. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Hello, everyone. We're presenting from Beijing. And today we have three parts in our presentation. First, we will provide you a very brief introduction with some notes on existing literature on contemporary China, especially for China's constitutional future, actually. And the second, our main story actually is stretching over three different periods from 1982 up to now. And thirdly, we might just, because our working paper is still under development, so we might just provide some conclusions for now. Now let's start. And the core question of this working paper is how to explain the change of constitutional discourse in contemporary Chinese constitutional law in a realistic context. Because in existing literature, we usually see people just talking about Chinese story like review articles. They could be very informative, right? With a relatively thick context, but actually they cannot provide a clear answer why this change actually happened in reality. So, for example, under the framework of global constitutionalism, like a global constitution agenda, China's future used to be think like, well, there could be some democratic future for China. And then in the late, I think in the more recently, in the last decade of this century, we also see the rise of varieties of constitutionalism as a framework to analyze other kind of constitutionalism. And so under the framework of socialist constitutionalism, scholars might think China's socialist system and also the whole regime might be more like a contemporary, not forever. But this also cannot go further than to describing the de facto.
The next group of literature goes further. One paradigm, I call it leader determinism. They try to explain the constitutional decay for the with the leader's influence. They think leader can change it all. But how? Yes, of course, the president can amend a constitution, but how could he change our discourse and ideal deep in our hearts? And the other paradigm, I call it legal scholarship activism. They believe that the scholarship can enlighten the society with constitutionalism, especially with the help of the internet, but now they failed. So our approach tries to give an internal comprehensive explanation on the interaction between power, scholarship, and the constitutional discourse. And our analysis stretches over three phases. The first one is the famous Dengist era, which had an unspoken constitutionalism, I think. because at that time, China had a reformer and conservative two-factional power structure, within which Mr. Deng Xiaoping changed or softened the discipline strategy over the intellectuals for serving the political reform, while on the other wing, the conservative elders set obstacles and finally ended this era in the 1989. So the double-faced power and strategies resulted in the double-faced re-establishment of the Chinese constitutional scholarship.
Yeah, and for the constitutional discourse during the first phase, let's say, we can see the discourse itself, actually, they remained very immature and presenting immature understanding and reception of unconstitutionalism and also other core knowledge of the constitutional law in the Chinese language and also the context. For example, they usually use political law to argue for power limits, but there was no judicial review or constitutionalism such word in Chinese writings. But at the same time, the discourse actually functioned very effectively in designing a possible constitutional reform through very sincere bridges reaching from the power. And one glorious production during that time was the 1982 Constitution itself.
The second phase was the economic reform era or the globalization era since the 1990s. But things went different. China had expansion and the professionalization of the whole constitutional scholarship at that time, because the market-oriented government always needed the legal scholars to make specific or department laws. But how about our fundamental constitutional law?
So during the second phase, let's say, we can see there are two strong trends going on in the scholarship. The first one is the normative discourse, of course, and because of the growing up of self-awareness among the hearts of constitutional lawyers, and also after the establishment of the Chinese Academy of Constitutional Law. And the second one is more special. We call it political constitutionalism. It's a school actually, a group of authors writing on that topic. And they argued, like, if we want to do the real research for the Chinese constitutional law, we have to look into the political reality, which means the ruling party and the party state structure. But there is also a very clear gap between the transplanted doctrinal research and the political constitutional studies. And for most of the scholars, they have to take a side and also keep their choice into the future. Now here comes a new era. And during this new period, the power strategy, they went back to coherent and also with some specific details beyond that. For example, in the name of the Constitution, and the National Constitutional Day was established like 5 years ago. But among the scholars, if some very sincere scholar, they want to continue use the word of constitutionalism, they have to be muted in their writings and teaching. They have to change it to another word choice. And so the use of constitutionalism in scholarship was reduced very significantly. But for some of the others, they choose to become the cheerleaders and to justify the de facto by adopting a new conception, which called 宪制.
And what is 宪制? I think it is a counterfeit of the so-called Western constitutionalism. Or in Trump's word, it's a fake one. But I think it is a keyword today for us to understand the discourse, the idea, and even the academic paradigm for the whole social scientists in China now. And the Chinese word 宪制, or the institution of constitution, I think that the translation, maybe that's, I think that there are three main differences from the original constitutionalism. First, as for the signified object, the 宪制 refers to the existing regime rather than an idealistic blueprint. Second, as for the specific question, Chinese works titled with 宪制 inquires what the fundamental institution structure of China actually is, instead of whether these institutions need to be reflected or constrained. And last, as for the methodology, studying 宪制 usually examines Chinese history and reality through the perspective of particularism, refusing to evaluate them according to an universal constitutional principles.
Now, we are going to conclude this presentation very briefly on 3 points. The first one is in explaining China, we argue, or we found that the driving force behind the change, the ups and downs in using constitutionalism in constitutional discourse actually is the gambling between the power and the intellectual. The second, in reconsidering constitutional building, we found there is a dilemma in different periods. Once the Chinese scholars, they want to defend normativity in their research, or at least taking that direction, they sacrifice the reality, their perspective into the reality. And on the way around, if they want to pay more attention to the Chinese reality, they sacrifice legal normativity or constitutional normativity. And so how legal scholars could defend constitutionalism in different countries in their own works, I think we ought to keep a balance between idealism and realism.
And the last point, I think, maybe for the future research, because as a political scientist today, I always believe that political science and constitutional studies share a lot of research agendas. The power knowledge analysis may help us to understand the driving forces behind the legal knowledge, and moreover, to reflect on the global political decay, no matter in China or in the West today. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much both for that really fascinating presentation. It sort of resonated a lot with the opening remarks from Professor Stone. And I think what you're articulating is, to a certain extent, it resonates very strongly with a lot of the positions that people are in countries suffering democratic decay as well. Do you try and just anatomize what is happening? Or do you try do you retreat into artificiality by only talking about what the idealized scenario is? And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have as scholars is trying to actually achieve a true picture, but maintain a focus on principle. Yeah.
Yes, if we agree with you. Yeah.
So thank you so much. And we're moving on to, and last but never least, two leaders from our cousin association, the International Society of Public Law, ICON. We have Rosalind Dixon from the University of New South Wales and David Landau from Florida State University, speaking on abusive judicial review and how it's quite common for courts to undermine the minimum core of democracy through judicial review. Now, just before I hand over to you, I just want to remind our audience that you can send questions through the Q&A function. So please do feel free to ask questions. So over to you, Roz and David.
I wanted to, what we wanted to do basically is kind of talk about the role of courts, I think, in moments of democratic erosion. This is recent. It's also kind of an offshoot of a bigger project we've done called Abusive Judicial Review. The basic idea is to kind of theorize about there's a lot of work that suggests courts are defenders of democracy at key moments, right? There's some case studies that have gone into that. And there's kind of a critical literature that discusses the role that that courts might have. So for example, Tom, co-convener of this event, has written a book called The Alchemist that essentially expresses some skepticism, right, of the role that courts can play in defending and protecting democracy. Our take was kind of from a different perspective. It was essentially to look at the various ways in which courts actually kind of attack democracy or undermine it. Unfortunately, we find that it's a fairly common phenomenon, right? So the courts become one of the key tools by which democracies get undermined, essentially. How does this sort of happen, or what do we kind of define it as? I guess the basic definition that we give, kind of drawing on our work, is we look at kind of courts as intentionally attacking sort of what Roz and I've called kind of the minimum core of democracy, right? In other words, the core of kind of the core essentially of electoral democracy by, for example, undermining elections, repressing opposition parties, getting rid of term limits, banning opposition parties, right? Just to give a few sort of recent examples. And we explore this basically as a regime strategy, right? On the one hand, so we look at how regimes around the world potentially capture courts, right, and then deploy them as tools. So we're trying to contribute to some degree to this significant literature on how attacks on courts happen, right, and how the different ways in which capture can occur, and then on top of that, kind of ask a set of questions like why are courts used so frequently or so significantly as a tool to attack democracy, basically. And what we kind of think about is, that judiciaries do seem to give regimes or would-be autocrats basically a set of advantages, right, over using other kinds of tools. To some degree, this picks up on some of the stuff that Michael was talking about in voter suppression, right, which is that there is sort of more and less obvious ways of carrying out authoritarian maneuvers, and you get both domestic and kind of international advantages sometimes from using techniques that are kind of subtler, right? So you could, of course, go into the opposition party's offices, just arrest everybody, right, or use pure force. But if you instead use a constitutional court, right, to ban that party and essentially dissolve it, you might get some advantages or some kind of benefits of legitimacy, both from the domestic and the international population. And one thing we think is notable is like courts are treated differently for good reason at the international level, right? There's a kind of presumption of legitimacy that goes into judicial action at the international level, right? When you're using courts as opposed to other actors. We think a little bit about kind of types of benefits that regimes receive, right? And we kind of create a typology, a sort of weak form of the phenomenon and a strong form. The weak form basically is the sort of rubber stamp role, right, that courts sometimes play. So in other words, courts legitimating the actions of a regime, saying, regardless of how seemingly unconstitutional or problematic a given action is, saying that's fine, right? This is okay. There's prominent examples of that one can draw on from a number of countries around the world. We look at places like Venezuela, also Poland and Hungary, right, where the courts seem to play this role pretty significantly. So you have laws that are passed that seem pretty clearly in tension with basic constitutional values, and the courts say it's okay, right? That's kind of the weak form. It's, I think, been kind of thought about a little bit more, but it's interesting. And I think one question also that's interesting is like when do regimes receive that kind of legitimacy benefit from judicial review? We don't think it's evenly distributed, right? A lot of it actually we think comes from courts that at one time had a reputation for independence or kind of strength that gets kind of drawn down after being captured by a regime, right? But the regime in a sense can draw on the residual legitimacy that the court provides. Probably the more interesting form of the phenomenon that we talk about is a strong form, which is where courts actually kind of clear obstacles, right? For for would-be autocrats, basically, right? So they carry out a number of tasks for the regime. What do these look like? Well, obviously they sort of vary by case, right? But to give a few kind of prominent examples from the paper, Cambodia, the ruling party in 2013 almost loses an election, right? The opposition does surprisingly well. So they turn to the courts and basically have the major opposition party banned. And then in the next election, they sweep, right? Because there's no longer an organized opposition for them to compete with. So that's one. Others, we look at the example of Venezuela, where the opposition party wins control of the legislature in elections in 2017, and the court then the regime, the Maduro regime turns to the court, and the court basically uses a series of doctrines to essentially nullify all of the legislature's power, right? So literally just kind of holds the legislature in contempt, transfers budgetary powers to the president, strikes down on a number of different grounds every law passed by the legislature. A third example, kind of dramatic one throughout Latin America, is term limits. So a number of autocrats or would-be autocrats in the region turn to courts when they face term limits that they don't have the votes to get rid of, right? So they're in the Constitution, they might be in an eternity clause, or they don't have the votes to get rid of them. So they turn to the courts as kind of a way to clear the obstacle. And courts develop an argument in that context that there's a human right, basically, to re-election of both voters and elected officials. And they develop that argument throughout the region as a way to kind of oust these term limits, allowing leaders to stay in power indefinitely in contexts where there's a significant risk of democratic erosion. So on the one hand, as we say, like, it's a regime strategy, right? I think on the other hand, it's also interesting that courts themselves, and this links to a book that Roz and I have in press right now, called Abusive Constitutional Borrowing. Courts themselves are kind of prolific abusive constitutional borrowers. What I mean is they're pretty good in these contexts of drawing on ideas that are liberal democratic ideas to do things that are anti-democratic, right? So the development of a set of principles drawing on international human rights as a way to get rid of term limits, which is a essentially baseless argument, right? But it's a way to carry out kind of the dirty work, basically, of authoritarians. The development of the legislative omission doctrine I referred to in Venezuela, kind of similarly, the abuse of that doctrine to essentially shut down a legislature. We go through kind of a number of examples, both in the paper or the book, of how, interestingly, courts draw on ideas from liberal democracy, but carry them out for anti-democratic ends. And that, to us, is kind of a scary thought, because it suggests a manipulability, right, of these doctrines. The unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine, for example, is usually seen as a defense of democratic ideas or constitutional ideas. But these term limit examples, which usually use some variant of that doctrine, show that you can just as easily use ideas like that for anti-democratic ends, right? So there's a set of implications, we think, for the way that we think maybe about democratic discourse more broadly, the kind of relative emptiness of that discourse. And I'll skew the temptation to say too much, I think, about the US in this context, but the last few weeks for me have been kind of harrowing, looking at a context in which it seemed like there was a possibility of exactly the phenomenon we kind of drawn out, abusive judicial review within the United States. Thankfully, it doesn't seem to have developed, right? But the arguments were there, things were teed up. I think it's an interesting and important question, why you haven't seen it, right? I think you could tell both a more optimistic and more pessimistic kind of story about what's going on in the U.S. in terms of the role of the judiciary at this moment, and more broadly, the role of liberal democratic ideas. Right? It's fascinating to me to see this picks up a little bit on some of Michael's points, but the discourse about the right to vote being used effectively to suppress the vote is fascinating and suggests a thinness maybe to modern liberal democratic discourse that itself is a problem. There's a lot more I'd want to say. I can talk some about implications, although I think they're very complex, right? I think one of the problems of this phenomenon is precisely that, you know, we want to give courts this kind of privileged place in transnational discourse. We want regimes to encourage judicial review. At the same time, we need to be aware of what Roz and I call this dark side, basically, of the phenomenon. With that, I think I'll conclude. I'm not, if Roz, do you want to, are you there? Do you want to?
I'm sorry, I just couldn't get the screen to cooperate before. So I just
Okay.
want to draw out a couple of things that David said and then connect it to some of the earlier presentations before we go to our discussion. So the first is just to say that we think that, you know, abusive judicial review is an under-noticed phenomenon that does occur in a range of cases. And even though it doesn't characterize a large number of cases, it's a growing danger. And so in a way, we're just calling attention to it as something that we need to be more alive to as comparative scholars, as a potential real and existent but emergent danger. And as David said, it's worse than Tom's you know, very insightful account in The Alchemist, which says the courts may be ineffectual. It's maybe the courts are effectual, but for the wrong ends. And so it sort of builds on that literature and takes Tom's skepticism toward the sort of Sujit Chowdhury, Sam Zakharov and others' position and says, actually, it may even be worse than Tom suggested. So it's a kind of cautionary note. And we think that there are real and important examples of it. You know, Wojciech's book on Poland shows it in more detail than our paper. But we worry that it could get worse before it gets better, and we need to be more cautious and alive to it. And as David said, you know, both of us were worried about if the election came down to the Supreme Court in the US, whether this phenomenon might be coming to the US. I think fortunately we may have avoided that this time. Cheryl can tell us what's going on in Pennsylvania, but you know, it seems unlikely, but it's a real and serious possibility that we need to be more alive to. The second is there are some self-limiting tendencies in the phenomenon, but they're not as strong as you'd hope. And therefore, the global and elite community that responds to courts needs to be more proactive in responding to it. So as David said, the kind of idea that you draw down your legitimacy as a court as you become less independent is real. But because of a gap, if you like, between elite and popular knowledge, the public doesn't always catch up right away with the degree to which a court has been compromised. Unless it is blatantly a tool of the regime, if it is plausibly still doing legal work, then it's not something that is immediately apparent to the public that the court is no longer truly independent and promoting democratic constitutionalism and the rule of law. And so it can take quite a while for the effect of capture, a degradation, to be apparent. And in that period of time, the court can do a lot of bad, right? It can attack democracy with the imprimatur of legal legitimacy, which it actually lacks. Eventually, it wears its own legitimacy down and it becomes so transparent. So we discuss in the paper Thailand is a really hard case. Thaksin is a would-be autocrat. You then get the, you know, sort of monarchy and the yellow shirt, you know, network monarchy resisting him in ways that there's democracy and authoritarianism on both sides. But whatever you think of the role of the court, and, you know, I've been very persuaded by both Sarah Bishop and Kem Thong's differing accounts of this, whatever the court was doing to start with, by the end, everyone's lost faith in the court. They say, well, however independent it was to start with, it's not anymore, right? And so over time, the court can wear its own legitimacy down in ways that may be self-correcting, but there's a longish period there where that's likely not to be true. And that puts pressure on global elites and national elites, but especially global elites like ourselves, to call courts out for being undemocratic, even though the notion of court and democracy is a very real tension. We have to be willing to say this does not seem to us to accord with judicial independence and the rule of law, for the Polish court to be doing what it was doing, or the Cambodian court, etc. And so that even though we promote the rule of law in courts as a key part of that as a global community, we have to be willing to call courts out for when they are doing abusive judicial review, even if not calling out the motive, at least calling out the impact. And then the last thing I want to say is just to draw out what David said about the connection between this paper that we explain in the blog and that is in print now and the forthcoming book, which is we think that abusive judicial review is a special case of a more general phenomenon. And the more general phenomenon is abusive borrowing. And courts are both actors in abusive borrowing, they engage in it, and they are targets of abusive borrowing. Regimes abusively borrow the legitimacy of courts and judicial review to achieve their ends. And courts are more or less willing in that process. At some point, we have this great anecdote in the paper about the Burundi court, where they were literally essentially threatened with death or violence against their family if they didn't cooperate in a term limit extension. No voluntary participation by a court. You cannot say that the Burundian court engaged in willingly abusive review. It engaged in purely instrumental review at the whim of the regime. To instances like Venezuela, where the court seems pretty captured and willingly advancing the aims, right? So we want to draw out that the courts are both instruments of abusive borrowing and targets as institution of the regime's abusive borrowing strategy. And we explained that there are 4 key techniques, which we're happy to talk more about in questions. But the thing that I want to just suggest in closing is the following. When we study things, going back to where Adrian started us, as the academy, we're often very forward looking, but sometimes we're looking at yesterday's disaster, right? People always talk about the 9/11 Commission and 9/11. We were sort of getting ready for the problems of yesterday. And to some extent, David and my feeling is that with our work on democracy and democratic resilience, to some extent, we're still catching up with the abuses of the last decade, and we are not seeing the next decade enough. Trump is taking Michael Powell and others' work and saying, aha, I can now use the discourse of voter suppression to delegitimate a legitimate election result, right? And so that we're writing about voter suppression because it happened yesterday and last year, but tomorrow voter suppression is the new discourse of the authoritarians to attack the legitimacy of liberal democratic result. So basically our concern is that every idea that we come up with as a community that's meant to promote democracy, 10 seconds later, the would-be authoritarians have got the discourse, they've subverted it, and they're using it for their own ends. And so as a collective, we want to draw attention to this phenomenon so that when Michael goes around the world talking about voter suppression, he cabins his remarks very clearly with a view to avoiding Trump borrowing them. And I think that he's already starting to do that. You can see in some of how he presented his ideas. And I think that's part of what we're doing. And a last thought, David and I wrote something about the anniversary of 1989, and I just want to connect it to China. There's a kind of really interesting, one could say schizophrenia, but it's sort of more subtle than that. Would-be authoritarians right now are drawing off the arguments of how to borrow from the East and from the West in this really weird and interesting tension, right? So sometimes Orban says, I want to be like Singapore and China and Russia. And then the next moment he says, no, I actually want to be, sort of like the West, because look, we're just like Germany when we do gerrymandering, or we're just like the US, or, when we do this campaign finance. So there's this tension in how ideas travel. And our Chinese colleagues have talked about how liberal discourses may or may not be entering Chinese debates. But similarly, abusive borrowing is a specific form of trying to borrow the legitimacy of the liberal democratic project for anti-democratic ends. But that discourse is being combined in the hands of would-be authoritarians with an explicitly illiberal anti-democratic discourse that tries to draw off the legitimacy of successful non-democratic projects, and they get intertwined in ways that we should notice and be interested by. But our basic claim is that as a global community, we've got a problem on our hands, which is the things that we've built up, courts and all the interesting and important doctrines designed to curb democratic backsliding, erosion, decay, are now being inverted and subverted for the ends of authoritarian governments. And we can do more to stop it, but we have to start by being really alive to the danger and calling it out when it occurs.
Thank you, Roz, and thank you, David. Fascinating, especially for a court obsessive like myself. I think in many ways, listening to everyone that we've heard already, and we have, as hoped, about an hour left for discussion. What links all of these in many ways for me, and that has come out in particular in your discussion, is whether we're talking about things like social media and technological advancement more generally, or elections, or academics and universities, or strong courts, we've spent a long time thinking of those as inherently pro-democratic spaces and institutions. And they're so easily turned towards anti-democratic practices. And I think that's what we're trying to grapple with right now is, the overturning of the easy assumptions we had, especially concretized in the post-1989 moment, that we had a combination of these mechanisms that were all together driving us towards, sustaining our democracies and improving our democracies, liberal democracies, when I say democracy. So I'm really interested sort of to tease that out a little bit more in terms of, it seems like 2020 might be a little bit of a 1989 moment, that the scales are falling from our eyes about some of these issues. And we're starting to see, like Shireen and Andrew were talking about, that we might need big fixes, not just sort of tweaks or returning to what we had before. I think we're waiting still for questions to come in through Q&A. So can I just ask, does any of the panelists have a question for their co-panelists? I have plenty of questions, but...
I posed a question to Adrian in the chat, if I may, Tom.
Sure.
So Adrian, I really like the way in which you draw out academic freedom and academic knowledge as a public good that's both general and democratic. And I think all of your analysis is extremely persuasive. It seems to me, though, that you focus very heavily on the voter, democratic knowledge and the voter in how you conceptualize the democratic benefit, although it may be that your sort of resolution of reasonable disagreement is more general. But I wonder whether you downplay elite roles in democracy and the idea that democracy does have a commitment to a certain kind of reasoned, evidence-based representation as well as citizen judgment, and that you could make a third argument that is more at the level of representative decision-making in addition to popular decision-making, so that there's something in addition that requires defending democracy as a thicker idea and less participatory, but more substantive in its requirements and orientations, and therefore that requires a certain kind of, now I'm looking at Wojciech, if you like, public reason with some degree of evidence as a part of it.
Yeah, let me think about that a bit. So but a couple of quick responses. One is that it's interesting you put the point that way, because the response that I'm worried about and the response that I more often get in relation to this work is that it's too elite. Mm-hmm. And that there is, in this current moment, a real pressure on you to justify the position that I'm taking. And essentially, really, what I want to do is say that there's a democratic need for expertise.
Yeah, and I think you're shying away from that because of the criticism. And I think in doing so, perhaps you'd miss one of your most persuasive arguments, which is that, representative decision-making is meant to filter popular preferences through a commitment to deliberation and reason giving. And that means both actual deliberation and deliberation informed by reasoned ideas and understanding. So that, I mean, I think that's part of your natural commitment, but in trying to avoid a sort of epistocracy, elitist conception, I think you avoid what is a natural argument to strengthen your case.
Thank you. And I want to take that on board, but I just want to say this. I think even if you don't take that position, if you really are, part of what I'm trying to say is even if you're really, really focused on a kind of egalitarian idea about participation. And even if you have sort of, a strong view about, say, free speech in public discourse, what I'm really trying to say is that that view of democracy can only work if there is this infrastructure that's already in place around having knowledge and information that we are prepared to accept, that we're prepared to at least engage with each other on, and we're prepared to resolve our disagreements in relation to. So I think my focus on that isn't just sort of a shyness. I think it's also about saying that that kind of commitment only makes sense. So if you think about like an open marketplace of ideas, a vigorous marketplace of ideas, that only makes sense if you've got some institutions doing the work of ensuring that we have good information that goes into those into that form of public discourse. So I think it's a little bit more than that, but I take your other point and I want to think about it some more, and I'm sure you're right that I can bolster this argument in various kinds of ways.
It's just complementary. It's not to detract from that as your primary argument.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Thank you.
Can I just jump off that conversation and pitch a question to Han and Chen? I'm just interested to know how much of the developments, especially regarding on the movement towards a political constitutionalism, which you describe as scholars moving away from the artificial Western liberal discourse and more towards being faithful to the power map of the reality of power in China. How much of that political constitutionalism is just a discussion within academia, and how does it connect with the wider society?
The first is actually, let's say, the political constitution school. Why we call it a school? Because it used to be a very strong trend emerging among the across the academia. It started around 2008 and declining in more recent years. And this is the time period. And for their discussion, actually, there were two internal different directions within this political constitutional school. The first one is more liberal, and they argue for example, one typical argument from the liberal wing, let's say, within the political constitutional studies, and they think the 1982 constitution inherited very precious seeds for liberal constitution, for building up liberal constitutionalism in China in the future through, if we continue the progressive constitutional amending or amendments. This is one position. And on the for the other wing, let's say it's more conservative, and they look, yes, they took very deep insights into the political structure and also the party state itself, but actually they are trying to justify the let's say this term. It's a very specific term in Chinese constitution law. Let's say it's the people's sovereignty under the party's leadership, and this is the core thesis for this conservative wing. And as for the realistic influence, let's say, because the political constitution school they rose in a better era, let's say like 10 years ago, and the public atmosphere were more open, so they have they acted very very effectively with the mass media and also on the internet. And we also have collected a lot of evidence we might use in our working paper. And this is the answer from my side. So.
Just a short, a small supplement, because in fact, 10 years ago, when we were still university students, Miss Zhai was the member of the political constitutionalist school, and I was a member of the so-called Confucian constitutionalism school 10 years ago. But now, if we judge the social influence or academic influence, it depends on to which meaning we refer to. if we refer to the original intention of us to find the balance between the constitutional normativity and the Chinese order Confucian reality, I think the two schools, both of the two schools died now. But if and had no influence in the society. And the words had already been banned by, to some degree, by the government and by the scholars themselves. And if you refers to the new version of the so-called political constitutionalism, which give up the normativity and admit the legitimacy of the reality and the total ruling of the CCP, I think it has already become the mainstream ideology, part of the ideology for the whole society and the whole government.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. And I see a few questions are starting to come in from panelist to panelist, but I do want to take a question from an audience member. Alexandra Flynn has asked, and I think this sort of speaks to the wider discussion about where power lies in any political system. And the question is, has tolerance for executive power increased in democratic countries? And if so, how does it nest with ideals of participatory, meaningful democracy? So I'd be interested to hear maybe Mike's view on that first, and then I might pitch to Shireen, and feel free to come in, Cheryl, Jose, David, if you have an answer to that, Adrienne. But I'll pitch to Mike first. What do you think?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to Alexandra for the question. I'm pretty persuaded by Tarun Kaitan's framing of this, that a lot of what we're talking about in democratic decay is not driven by the legislature. It's really driven by executive aggrandizement, and that could be vis-a-vis civil society. It's some of the discussion we've been having about universities. It could be in relation to legislature itself, or capture of the judiciary, or fourth branch institutions like election commissions and others. It's another area that I've been working on. It's executive capture of those independent institutions. That's the worry, right? That's the abuse that we are focused on. So I'm not sure I would frame it as increased tolerance for executive power as much as it's primarily, like, as descriptively, it's an executive power grab that we are witnessing in Turkey, Hungary, Poland, and other jurisdictions. Not only, but primarily.
Great, thank you, Mike. Anybody else want to offer a view on that?
Tom, Cheryl, did you want to go first? Oh, I wanted to hear your thoughts, Cheryl, so I hope you'll jump in after me. But look, just reflecting on the Australian phenomena, I think, and it relates to some of what Andrew and I were talking about in terms of the changing nature of democratic debate in a society with proliferating social media, decreasing attention spans, bombardment of information. It's sort of more this, the executive now seems more able to avoid accountability, perhaps, than in this culture. So, in Australia, we've seen the sports rorts type scandals, the purchasing of the airport land, the obfuscation around whether or not a federal ICAC will be established and whether that will have any teeth. So this avoidance of executive accountability, but then the news cycle seems to move on very quickly, and public memory doesn't seem to stick to the particular news story for more than a day or two. So it's really strange phenomena of a public that has short bursts of outrage, and then it subsides very quickly, and there appears to be no long-term accountability and no electoral consequences of this kind of behaviour. And Cheryl, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on this, because I've seen some of your commentary around that stuff as well.
Thanks, Shireen.
Yeah.
Cheryl.
Can I come in, Tom?
Absolutely.
Look, I think that it's clear that there is an expansion of executive power. Whether there's a greater tolerance of it, who knows? I mean, it depends how much we understand. One of the problems is that executive power is exercised in such complex ways that it's hard to hold people accountable, as Shireen says. The institutions for doing so are degrading. And it's just very hard to understand what's going on, even with sports frauds. You know, one of the most obvious examples of abuse of executive power, it's hard to get people to understand the illegalities and the unconstitutional dimensions of it, particularly when they're getting money at the end of the day. So, you know, it's a phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that we need to take seriously and try to probe some of the ways in which this is occurring. But I think at the end of the day, it also partly reflects the weaknesses of our legislatures. Now, maybe they've always been weak, but at the moment, we seem to be unclear even about what they're there for, and they're affected by a decline of representation. And I was thinking of this as Shireen and Andrew spoke. I mean, they were talking about the potential of deliberative mechanisms, the potential of citizens' assemblies. All of that is true. I'm enthusiastic about those as well, but they don't work either unless your system of political representation works. And if you follow the Thomas Piketty line, you've got the problem of the Brahmins and the merchants in control of the key political parties. And this is one of the things that somehow we have to work on. I wish I had the solution, but I do think that there are places around the world you can look to where political party representation works a lot better than it does in some of the countries we're concerned about, including Australia. And that we need, in addition to looking out for abusive constitutionalism, we need to look out for instances of constructive constitutionalism as well. And publicise those to try and deal with this trust deficit and build up our representative legislatures.
Can I say something briefly about that,
Absolutely,
Tom?
Roz, yeah.
And, you know, picking up on what Cheryl says, not just, you know, constructive but abusive, but not overcall abusive when it's subject to reasonable disagreement. So one of the things that David and I emphasize is that the word abusive itself can be overused. Oren Tamir has a nice piece about this. And, you know, some things, maybe things we really dislike, but they're not abusive. So, you know, Bush v. Gore, terrible decision, probably not abusive. A bunch of decisions that we would personally strongly disagree with, still probably not abusive. And so I think, as Cheryl says, calling out the positives, the extreme bad cases, and then in between recognising the space for the kind of discourse and resolution that Adrian was gesturing at in terms of that mechanism for resolving disagreements in a certain way. And so I do think there's both an importance to emphasising constructive engagement and constitutionalism and the scope, which might be bad, but not abusive.
Thanks, Roz. And that really...
Can I say a word?
Please, yes.
Sorry. Sorry, but I didn't mean to interrupt you, Tom. Go on, and I'll then come in.
Oh, well, I'm quite happy to cede the floor to you, Wojciech. I'm always interested to hear from you.
Thank you so much. So I just want to follow up on what Ross has just said, because I think that it is extremely important to distinguish between those instances of judicial review which may be seen abusive from democratic point of view, and those which we simply dislike, and we may dislike them for very good reasons because they are non-libertarian or non-egalitarian or whatever, but which do not necessarily, how should I say, taint the political system as less democratically legitimate. So we need to have a certain matrix, and I just wonder whether in your book you provide a relatively strict matrix of when an instance of judicial review will properly count as abusive. But I wanted to, from that, to move on to a question which I had still to both of you, David and Ross, because I liked very much when Ross alluded in her summary of their project that there are also certain limits to this abusiveness of by courts. And if I may press you just a little bit further on that, what would be your taxonomy of such limits? Why? Because I think that, you know, that would be a more rosy or optimistic picture in an otherwise very gloomy picture, that there are some very important limits or self-imposed limits, which are both intrinsic and extrinsic. Some of the intrinsic limits upon this abusiveness may be simply the composition, the setup of the court. We may have some remaining judges from the older, better days, and who are willing and able to offer resistance to pressures from the executive and the legislature. We may have some new judges who may turn out to be renegade, because there may be certain deliberately created set of circumstances of the noblesse oblige type that judges simply are unwilling to be seen as being sort of totally spineless executors of the will. But I'm thinking also, and I'll stop at that, I'm also thinking about some more fundamental, maybe extrinsic limits on it. And that is that from the point of view of the effectiveness and of the best, if you like, reasons applying to the new authoritarians themselves, it is really worthwhile maintaining reasonably independent judiciary, or at least the judiciary which may be seen as reasonably independent. And there is a well-recognized scholarship about how independent courts are useful to authoritarians. And the recent weeks in Poland, which you would imagine is my favorite case study, just show how disastrous it is for the authoritarians themselves to erode the court, constitutional court in this case, of any independence, because they cannot they cannot then perform these courts cannot in any credible way perform the dirty job that the executives wants them to do. And when they have handed down this absolutely outrageous judgment on abortion, the protesters, the thousands of women, didn't go to protest in front of the Constitutional Tribunal building. It would be useless. I mean, they had nothing to do with it. They went to protest in front of the private residence of the leader. And in this way, in a sense, the executive shoots itself in the foot when it deprives the court of that modicum of independence, which is useful for the blame game by the executive. So what do you think about it?
David, do you want to go? Or can I say something quickly first?
Go ahead, Russ. Yeah.
So, I mean, you've pressed us all along, Wojciech, very generously on the definition, and you've made it sharper and better, although it's never going to be perfect. But we'll get back to that. On the second, I think you've pointed to the answer to your own question. So, our claim is that it's hard to tell when the limit kicks in, but that when it becomes apparent to the citizenry that the court is no longer in any meaningful way independent, but simply the instrument of the regime, well, it stops being a good strategy anymore. And the fact that people, are taking the protest to the executive, not the court, means they know now, right? Now, there are pockets of resistance in ways that have been thankfully apparent in your own cases. Touch wood, it's not finished yet, but I think that the point is when the citizens know that the way to protest against a court decision is to go to the executive, the strategy is starting to unravel. And so that if you think about the kind of Landers and Posner work, some of the other American political science, economics informed work, authoritarian regimes get something out of independent courts, right? So the perfect authoritarian has to balance control and independence in a way that may mean that it's a long-term stable strategy. Sometimes we lose, but we lose in order to preserve the veneer of independence that then helps us in the cases we really need. But if the authoritarian kind of presses their case too hard and too fast and they want complete control, well, then it may become apparent to the citizenry in ways that then redound against them. So it's kind of like if you abuse judicial review just occasionally and a little bit, it's a very successful strategy. But if you want to do it a lot and fast in a way that becomes fully transparent, well, then you kind of earn down the power it has to support you. And I think Poland is still very much up for grabs, but the kind of signs that you point to of people knowing that they have to go to the regime rather than the court is a very promising one, not for the rule of law, but for the long-term resistance to the regime strategy. On the definitional question, we've gone back and forth a lot. And we've basically come down to the view that one should talk about abusive judicial review or abusive borrowing in both a weak and a strong sense. The strong sense does include intent in the ordinary sense of willing, reckless, knowing, it doesn't have to be intentional. It has to be kind of constructively knowledge. And that often you'll never be able to get evidence of that, but we think using the word requires one to identify some knowing participation, and knowing just not when you have a gun to your head in Burundi, but when you have some choice about the matter. But we think effect by itself is the key, and by itself enough to suggest that it's at least a weak form of the phenomenon. And often, effect will be the best evidence that we have of intent. So this, for American trained constitutional scholars, is the kind of Yick-Wo or Gamillion type cases where we infer invidious purpose from overwhelmingly negative effects. So we do build intent into our definition, but we recognize that it's often going to be extremely hard to prove directly. Therefore, you'll be relying on evidence of effect to infer it. And that even if you cannot prove intent, it's still a troubling phenomenon that's worthy of attention, just not worthy of the same response. You don't call people bad faith actors if they're doing it by accident. And, if you're going to take the Thai example again, going back a bit, some of those early Thai cases, it's pretty clear that the court thought they were doing the right thing. It just happened to be very unsuccessful as a democracy protecting strategy because it empowered a military coup. But for some period of time in the early period, the court thought, I guess we should stop this Thaksin guy. And then all of a sudden, 10 years later, now they're just upholding regime after regime claim that's now blatantly authoritarian. And it's not clear that Yingluck is worse than the dictators for democracy. It's unclear, right? So I think our insistence is that we should study both the strong and the weak form, but that the true word abuse has to have a sort of normative connotation where intent is part of it, although you prove it often through effects. David?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. That's great, Roz. I think, I guess I make a couple points. One on limits, that's terrific, Wojciech. It's very helpful. I think you're right in the way that you summarize limits and suggest would-be authoritarians face essentially a set of trade-offs. Some of those I would point out are kind of temporal. The needs that an actor has are different at different times and in different kinds of regime types. And that's just very interesting. And one thing that Roz and I note, kind of drawing on Hungarian and Polish case, among others, is a kind of 1-2 punch where you try to weaken a court, then you capture the court, right? And that's an interesting strategy because the two kind of cut against each other, right, in a way. The other point is, it's interesting that the literature on the utility of courts to authoritarians generally deals with relatively established authoritarian regimes, where it seems to me that actually then the need for like foreign investment and things like that may cut in some cases in favor of a kind of bounded independence, right, for the court to be able to carry out tasks for the regime. You face a different set of imperatives when you are trying to, in a kind of competitive authoritarian context or an eroding context where you're trying to gain advantages over your opponents, in which case using the court to kind of repress your opponents may be extremely useful. However, having done that, as you know, you can't just kind of switch back to another mode, right? It's difficult to do that. So I think that it does highlight a kind of problematic set of trade-offs. With respect to definitions, I think it's exactly right. One of the things we try to do in the book, first of all, set up a minimal definition of democracy, right? That draws on political science and that is pretty clearly, that we do kind of, there's going to be borderline cases, right? But that kind of sets out, look, it's got to go to kind of the core of electoral democracy or it's not going to count under our definition. And part of that also is disentangling, I think, democracy from liberalism, right? In liberal democratic constitutionalism. This is a tricky thing because I think most of the time, the two, as we know from recent experience, the two erode together. Attacks on liberalism tend to be attacks on democracy. Actually, and much of the time, you look at actors like Orban, who will happily define themselves as kind of illiberal Democrats. But in reality, they're tilting the electoral playing field, right? That's what they're doing. But we think we identify some cases, right, where it looks like there's an attack on liberalism, but it really doesn't have an effect on what we call the democratic minimum core. Some of the immigration related stuff, for example, we think would plausibly fit that. And I think it's important to point that out as well, right? So it's got to be the case that the definition is narrowly bounded. And we do think the right way to do that for a number of reasons is a kind of an electorally focused definition of democracy. The trick, of course, is that even an electorally focused definition of democracy of necessity brings in other things, because we know that you cannot protect the electoral playing field, right, without protecting other things, a core set of rights, et cetera.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, this sort of speaks to what seems to be one of the core challenges of this entire area, if we're talking about threats to democracy, is how do we make those fine judgments? How do we make sort of appreciate questions of degree when we have these sort of subtler and less overt sort of threats? And number one, this links to a question Roz has sent to Mike about, can we have a more gradated discourse about the degrees of suppression we should be worried about, and in that way avoid the sort of Trump borrowing of core voter suppression elsewhere. And I'm really interested to hear from you about that, Mike, because in your interview you said people bandy around suppression so easily. But beyond you, Mike, as well, I think it would be interesting to hear from Shireen and Andrew. How do we regulate political advertising, for example, when we might be trying to figure out questions of degree, appropriateness, what's damaging, what's not to democracy, and so on. So I'll pitch to you, Mike, first.
Thanks, Tom, and Roz for the question. So I haven't been thinking about it in terms of borrowing. Obviously, I was trying to make the pitch that voter suppression can work in a bunch of different regime types and at different points in the electoral system that happen to be vulnerable. So I think practically we do see borrowing happening. That's just not how I had framed it. So what are the different kinds of voter suppression, I think is another way of asking it, or which ones are worse than others. So you could just say, like, which does the most harm, right? How many voters are dissuaded from turning out? That is not actually a useful metric, because the whole logic of voter suppression is you just make it harder to vote. You don't make it impossible. And so voters are motivated enough, they can overcome not any barrier, but almost any barrier. And especially if you have a two-party system or two large parties and you have close elections and turnout is far less than 100% as it is in most democracies that don't have mandatory voting, a relatively small shift in the electorate can actually make a big difference. And I think there is some evidence that prominent allegations of voter suppression actually motivate voters to become educated. What do I need to have? What are the procedures to get registered? All those things. So the kind of how many people it keeps away from the polls, I think is just not a good metric, because the way voter suppression works. Another way to look at it would be the more durable the suppression, the more serious it is. So voter suppression relies on some kind of correspondence between, like, how sure you are that a given group of voters is likely to vote for the other team, right? And so sometimes voter suppression backfires because voters change their minds, right? So I think sometimes there's a discussion, just to use the US as an example, military voters, we would have by default, and I think there's lots of data, likely to vote for the Republican Party. I think there's increasing data that's not the case, or it's not as uniformly the case. And so if voters are up for grabs, making it easier for that group to vote or harder to vote just is not as useful a strategy. But where there is like permanence or really a really durable relationship between the group's identity or demographics or interests, perceived interests, and a party, there the voter suppression is in a way more serious, because it's simply likely to last longer and be a more effective tactic. So the discussion on intent and effect is very interesting. I left that out of this presentation just on the interest of time, but the paper goes into that, right? So is voter suppression only a problem when it's deliberate, right? What if you just genuinely think it's good to have well-informed voters? So a test that every voter has to pass to prove how engaged they are with public affairs would just be a good thing because I'm a strong Democrat, right? Strong Democrat, and I think every voter should have incentives to learn more about the system in which they're participating. That would still dissuade or prevent some people from casting ballots, and I would still understand that as suppression. It's not as we can't critique it in the same normative way as a deliberate attempt, to exclude people, but it still has harmful effects. So where I end up, and I think again this ties into a lot of resonances between the papers, ties into that discussion of what the minimum core is. So what is the minimum core in a way about how we understand the minimum core of the right to vote? And I end up taking a very broad view of access, and the only way to address this is there should be 100%, all citizens should have the right to vote. We can have a different debate about non-citizens too in various contexts, but all citizens should have the right to vote. Doesn't matter if you're in prison, if you've committed a felony, if you're living out of the country, because once you open the door, prudentially, it's too easy to make, to say, well, this group's in and that group's out, and that simply gets, can be abused, okay? And then the onus is on, I would say us, I'll say, I don't want to be self-aggrandizing, not on me, but on us as a community of scholars, right? So what are the rules that make an election fair, right? And not just, do we have this right to vote in the abstract, but how long is it appropriate to wait in line before that dissuades people from voting? How many polling stations do there have to be? How easy does it have to be to register? And so this gets us in these very granular things, like, can you use your hydroelectricity bill to prove where you live and your identity so you can vote, right? But those are the kind of things that actually matter in this discussion. So the challenge is to frame it in a way that will apply to Kenya as it might in Canada, right? What does access mean? And that's a very steep challenge, but I think I end up with it, we have to identify the positive dimensions of the right to vote rather than viewing it simply as a negative right.
Great, thanks, Mike. And so many sort of potential questions flow from what you've just said, but some of them seem to me to connect with both what Adrienne has said at the start and what Shireen and Andrew were talking about as well. On Adrienne's side, it's if we're going to, for example, have evidence of voter suppression, this might be one of the roles that the academics can play, in terms of actually putting together evidence. And Vicky Jackson talks about universities in this role as objectivity institutions, that it's different when a non-aligned, non-partisan, hopefully, professor or institute says something versus a partisan affiliated, or party, actual party claims voter suppression, for example. And that feeds in with, I'd be interested to hear from you on that, Adrienne, but also would be interested to hear from Shireen and Andrew. How far have you gotten in thinking about where do you need to look and how do you need to judge political advertising and how to regulate it? Can you achieve objectivity in that? What would be the criteria to judge it by, and so on? So Adrienne, first, interested to hear from you.
Sure. Look, I think you're right to say that the authority and the kind of constructiveness of the intervention of scholars in this realm does depend on at least some plausible understanding of universities as non-partisan. And it is no accident that those who wish to undermine the place of expertise in political discourse, who have no wish for the resolution of certain kinds of disputes about the world, are seeking to undermine universities by characterizing them as institutions of the left. I think, therefore, it is really important that academics seek to protect academic freedom and the authority of universities with a strong ethical commitment towards non-partisanship, right, and viewpoint diversity. And those two things have to sit alongside the fact that, as academics as we can and should be, extremely opinionated.
Thanks, Adrian. Just before I move to Shireen and Andrew, can I just ask Han and Chen, is the school of political constitutionalism criticized by others as being simply in service to the government?
Some of them are. Yeah.
Of course.
You're quite right. But for the liberal wing, actually, they are more controversial in research methodology, because we actually provide more analysis in the dominant normative. They call it normative or interpretive methodology in the mainstream of Chinese constitutional law research. And actually, this choice, methodological choice, actually was built up on with very strong emotions. Although I think maybe it's it sounds a little bit odd to overseas colleagues, like there is no judicial review in China, or even some effective implementation of the reforming constitution, let's say. But why Chinese constitutional scholars, they are so loyal to doctrinal research? There is no case to read, but it's just with very strong emotion. They think it's the pure knowledge of the constitutional law, although it's largely transplanted. And so that's why the political constitutional research, the methodology is very controversial at the very beginning, like 10 years ago.
And another point in our research is that the authoritarian government, the clever authoritarian government in the new era, usually doesn't directly repress the constitutional scholars again. On the contrary, they can use the rewarding or other kind of remunerative methods to encourage the constitutional scholars or others scholars from other disciplines to serve for the ideology and government voluntarily, and correspondingly change their normativity and position. In a word, the more they serve for the government and mainstream ideology, the higher possibility they give up their normativity.
Okay, thank you so much. That's really illuminating. So I think we don't have a ton of questions coming in through Q&A. So I'm just interested to pitch once again to Shireen and Andrew, and just hear from you what your thinking is on how to regulate political advertising in particular.
So I think that there's probably certainly two examples in Australia where there is an attempt to regulate and have truth in media, truth in political advertising law. So South Australia has had it for a number of years, and then the Australian Capital Territory has recently introduced it. I think the jury's still out as to the efficacy of those particular interventions, and I think we'll need to see in coming years that the reality is that those jurisdictions, they still have fake news, they still have mistruths permeating their political debates. So I think one of the challenges is that a lot of those laws and the focus has been focused on traditional media and not necessarily online media. And as Shireen said, the 2019 election, so much of the discourse is now happening online. So I think definitely truth in media, truth in political advertising laws needs to be part of the armory. But we really need to be working with the social media platforms to understand how we can better shape and direct the debate towards truthful discussions rather than allowing mistruths to proliferate in the way that they have at the moment. Shireen, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add that it's been highly entertaining, and to see the way Twitter has tried to proactively take some responsibility in monitoring some of the US election tweets that come out from Trump. And notably, this is not something that I don't think Facebook does this yet, but one option is for Australian lawmakers to require, whether it's warnings that like Twitter have been putting up under Trump's tweets saying this has not been verified or this contradicts what this, that whatever authority says, And of course, just relating to what Adrian's been talking about, the tricky thing is always going to be in balancing free speech. And I think this is where we need to proceed with extreme caution in drafting these kinds of laws, because what we don't want to create is an intensified sense of what already exists, which is the ability of anti-democratic, for want of a better word, populists, to be able to say, well, my free speech is being hampered here, that I'm not allowed to put forward my point of view, right? So we need to be, yes, I think there needs to be better regulation of propagation of fake news and lies in election campaigns, but we need to figure out a way of doing that in a way that doesn't intensify the sense that some people feel left behind, some people feel their views are not heard. And in terms of the role that academics as independent experts might play in policing some of that, being some kind of independent expert in what's truthful and what's not truthful. Again, I think we need to be really careful and acknowledge the fact that our academic institutions have inadvertently been sucked into some of these culture wars. And so connecting to what Adrian has said about our institutions are now considered to be the Brahmin left, and we see government using that kind of rhetoric all the time in an oppositional way. We saw some of that ideology coming through with the JobKeeper, job seeker type policies. And we need to figure out how to diffuse that rather than exacerbate that. And I think Adrian's right that maybe there needs to be a more conscious effort to ensure viewpoint diversity within our academic institutions. But yeah, so I'd say, yes, we need truth in advertising laws, but we need to proceed with extreme caution to ensure that we are not further inflaming the problem.
Great. And I think Adrienne is going to come in with her own contribution here.
All I wanted to do, Shireen, is just really to intervene to say, one of the points that you might make in support of the sorts of measures that you're talking about is that a labeling response, for example, on Twitter is a more speech response, right? It's not actually stopping anyone talking. It's doing exactly what sort of classic libertarian ideology would say you should do, which is that you should, Twitter as a private actor should use its own voice to speak. And I think that's not coming across, I think, in the debate about this. And I'd encourage you to make that part of your analysis.
Definitely, I think that's a really good point.
There's some very early evidence around the efficacy of labeling, and we still need more evidence. The evidence that I saw is that it was only about an 8% reduction in reach in terms of when we just label things. It's far more effective where you've had third-party, vetted third-party organisations determine something as fake news, and then the online engines will actually deprioritize it in the feeds. So I think, we've got to balance efficacy and, we've got to take that into account. And I think there's some emerging knowledge that says simply tagging may not be the most effective way of doing that.
Great. Thank you so much. And it's such a difficult challenge, isn't it? Because there is also the possibility that you sort of use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. In Brazil, for example, one of the most worrying laws that's going through Congress right now is a bill that would make social media platforms liable for all speech on their platforms, which the worry is that they will just excessively censor to reduce their liability. So, we really need sophisticated approaches, sophisticated sort of remedies. So unless anybody has a burnt mic, do you have a?
Yeah, could I follow up on that? I think really interesting discussion on fake news and misinformation, disinformation. I think that's the hardest problem in that sphere of what's happening on social media right now because of the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, constitutional concerns. One of the, at least in Canada, we've been having a debate about micro-targeting and transparency. And so I wonder what your views, Andrew and Shireen, are on that, right? So, if you place a political ad on a TV show, everyone can see it and everyone can judge the content and assess the message, but also who decided to distribute the message. With micro-targeting, it can be sent right to an individual or a really small group of people, and it's simply that publicity aspect is not there. So I know in North America, there's been lots of discussion, maybe you shouldn't be able to micro-target down to the individual level or geographic level, should be, say, at the only level of maybe of the electoral district, or not much below that. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on micro-targeting and possible rules around transparency and publicity there.
So I think it's actually interesting with transparency and micro-targeting, the different rules that are applied by Facebook in different countries. So in the US, you actually get some data around the spend and the parameters that were used for micro-targeting. You don't have that in Australia. So I think as a first protocol that there is value in applying some of those transparency measures that we've already got in place in the US to other jurisdictions. I think that by itself is probably not going to get rid of all the negative aspects of micro-targeting. There's an argument that it does enable us to more appropriately target and deliver message to a more relevant group of users, right? So I think that there's positives and negatives. As our first point of call, I absolutely would be applying those transparency measures that exist elsewhere to Australia. Serena, I don't know if you'd add anything to that.
No, I think that's
great. Thank you so much. So I don't see any burning questions. I don't see any raised hands. So I think maybe it might be an opportune moment to simply wrap up. And oh, I think Cheryl had Cheryl, did you want to come in on one of these points?
No, look, I was just going to quickly ask Andrew a question, actually, just a factual question. I thought I read somewhere, Andrew, that the moves by Twitter and to a lesser extent Facebook to sort of signify untruths was driving people of certain inclinations onto other platforms. And if that's right, then that's sort of further polarizing people and suggesting we still need to dig for answers to some of these things.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. So our overwhelming focus is on the main platforms, but as those main platforms tighten up, and they, certainly know with Twitter for a lot of the QAnon pages, they've shut down and accounts recently. There's a lot of that then activity gets migrated to other platforms. Yeah. Now, I still think that that's a better situation because the reality is that these other platforms, they don't have a huge audience in the way that, say, Facebook and Twitter does. So I think it minimizes the blast radius of their activities, but it is still concerning. I mean, it's you shut down one bad practice on one particular platform and then it flourishes elsewhere. I think we need to continue looking at those other platforms and having conversations around those as well, and have active discussions with the owners of that platform as to what we can do.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to have a tech expert in the group. I feel like I could corner you and ask you all my questions. I have a laundry list, but I won't. I'll catch you another time. Okay, well, we do have a rather broad question here, but perhaps it might be one that we could pick up in webinar 2, which is how do we address the support for autocratic leaders in general? And I think that links back to the earlier question about the increased tolerance for executive power. I mean, we could flip that on its head and say, what is about executives becoming increasingly intolerant of other powers? And I think that's one of the key questions I think we're going to be picking up in some of the future webinars. I do want to end on a note of hope, which is in some of the future webinars as well. Of course, we're going to be talking about renewal as well, and we have covered renewal to a certain extent here this morning. The next webinar in the series, webinar 2, is on global challenges, the big picture. It's starting in exactly well, almost exactly 6.5 hours time. It's 7 p.m. Melbourne time. So we'll be sticking with a global overview, and we'll have talks on illiberal democracy and undemocratic liberalism, COVID-19 and populism, algorithmic governance and the rule of law, and rethinking liberalism. So once again, we'll be able to get our teeth into some of these questions a lot more fully. Now, before I let you go, I just want to give you some very quick information. The first is you can read more from today's webinar speakers. So the first is their blog posts are on the Roundtable blog, and these links are going to start appearing shortly. Here, they've just been put up for you. You can also watch the interviews with selected Roundtable speakers, and we've also put in there in the links more information on the association itself. There's a link to the membership information, both in English and in French. We have a link to the association's blog, the IACL AIDC blog. And the final two links there, the first is a new research group that's been set up under the IACL, which is Public Law Responses to Public Health Emergencies. And that really is a fantastic group, and the link there gives you information on what they're doing and how you can follow their activities and connect. The final is a COVID-19 ebook that's been edited by Professor Serna. It's COVID-19 and Constitutional Law, COVID-19 et droit constitutionnel, and the link is there. So there's plenty to read, plenty more to sort of follow up from this webinar. This is all a huge experiment. So thank you for joining us for webinar 1 of this experiment. And I really hope you can join us for webinar 2 and the rest. And webinar 2 is going to be chaired by my co-convener, Professor Wojciech Sadurski. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to the audience. And thank you to everybody who's helped in the background, Gabby Del Sasso, Astari Kusumo Ardani, Josh Snuckle, and Catherine Taylor. Goodbye, everyone.